This video is brought to you by Storyblocks. For a low-cost subscription to unlimited royalty-free assets for your next production, visit storyblocks.com/TedForbes. Let's get a little bit existential for just a second. So, what do you think is a photograph? A lot of times in my videos, you hear me refer to a photograph as essentially visual communication. So, beyond that, what is visual communication? Is it a visual representation of lens characteristics? Is it admiring a high megapixel count, details, and resolution? Is it a chance to tell everybody that you can still shoot on film? Or is it the ability to show people how much hard-earned cash you spent on a very expensive camera? Okay, it's clearly none of those things. However, visual communication, whether this is through a still photograph or through video, is an opportunity to show somebody something, period. So beyond that, it's the ability to communicate visually in a way that is going to tell somebody something and communicate who we are, what we believe, and possibly where we're headed. It's a visual record that will hopefully resonate the viewer and bring out a feeling of either nostalgia or, probably more important, things we've actually learned. So composition is at the heart of visual communication, and there's many different ways that you can look at composition. I did a bunch of videos many years ago just on compositional ideas, the rule of thirds, rule of odds, all the rules, so to speak, and it's amazing when I talk about those things how controversial they get when people don't understand that whether you're going with rules or guidelines or suggestions, or rather whether you're avoiding them entirely, communication is still dependent on that composition. The composition is your presentation visually. And of course, composition is at its best when all of the objects in the photograph are there for a reason, they belong, they support one another, and they support the fundamental idea that's being shown in the photograph. I know that sounds heavy. Basically, it's everything in there is important, its placement is important, and if something's in there that doesn't belong, it can potentially destroy the composition. And I'm sorry, we've all had this problem before. You know, I think the easiest example to look at is, let's say, street photography. We've all had those moments where we've caught something that was special in more of a street or a candid situation, and there's one thing that's in the background. It's a trash can, or it's a guy that moved through the image, or it's something that didn't belong, and unfortunately it made the shot a lot less successful. And of course, we take it in stride, and we move on, and we realize that we can't hit a home run every time. Now, we can hit a lot of singles, we can hit a lot of doubles, occasionally we get a triple, and the truth is you can't get a home run every time, so we have to do something between those home runs. So in this video, I want to talk about composition and understanding, learning composition, how important it is, so that you can improve your consistency over the long haul. It's not about getting something by accident every time. Sure, it doesn't always work out, but the more you can learn, the more you can put into this, the more you'll realize how important it is, and the more you'll realize how better and consistent you can be as a photographer too. So I mentioned those composition videos I did about rules. If you haven't seen those, I will link a playlist up here and in the show description. You can go check those out. They're very old videos. They really need to be updated, but the information is accurate. And believe it or not, most creative people that I know, including myself, actually prefer some little bit of constraint on what it is that we're doing. Creativity actually becomes easier if you're working in with something that's predefined. Then you can start to solve problems, and maybe you can come up with a new solution and you go a completely different direction, but you need some kind of starting point. And I think that sometimes rules can actually spawn more creativity. I'm going to give you a couple examples here, which I'm talking about. First example is actually a television show that had, I think, some of the best cinematography on anything on television. In fact, I think this whole show was one of the better things that I've ever seen. I'm talking about Mad Men, which was on AMC a number of years ago. Mad Men was directed and created by Matthew Weiner, who is an incredible director and writer who actually got his start on a show called The Sopranos, and then later moved over and started his own show, Mad Men, which essentially told the story of a fictitious advertising agency throughout the 1960s. It's a period piece, it's very retro, and it feels like you're watching something from the 1960s. Now, there are a number of interviews, this was obviously a very popular show, but the various directors of photography who worked on set that have talked about their process in doing this, and everything was with respect to the period, down to even the way they filmed it. This was done on Panavision cameras. They shot film for the first 4 seasons, I believe, until they moved to digital in season 5, which was done on an Arri Alexa, Panavision lenses, Panachromes, the whole thing, and even the set design is just really cool for the time, and it pays a lot of homage to the way that television shows and even films were produced in those days. One of my favorite examples is the office windows. They're not real. In fact, I remember the first couple times I saw this show, they're so convincing, but you know that in real real life, you could not capture that on camera because the windows would blow out or the room would be too dark. They're actually just fake walls that go back a couple feet, maybe about 5 or 6 feet, and then they use photographs for the various scenes and can change those in and out and change the lighting in the rooms completely. I think it's absolutely brilliant how it's done. Everything was shot with respect to film from that period. So for instance, and especially in the early seasons, everything's locked off. There are no moving shots. The way they frame up their subjects, and the term they use is nobody gets a haircut, and that's simply a cinematographic term, meaning you're not going to cut off the top of anybody's head, with the exception of maybe extreme close-ups, but everything has a very conservative feel to it. However, it is not retro. Things don't really look like this when you go watch old movies, and as much homage the producers were paying to past productions, this had an enormous amount of creativity to it, mainly derived from the story, and it communicated that in a visual way. So that's sort of what I'm talking about, and I think this is an extreme case in a video production where you have a television show that is kind of working within a set of constraints, and it's being creative based around those. And I think this is a really powerful thing that a lot of us can try in our own work to try to use something to get us at point A, and then we're going to figure out where point B is, but we use that as the starting point, and that's ultimately going to get us there. This is clearly oversimplified because I'm not even getting into the storyline, the way it was scripted, the acting performances, the symbolism that you see, foreshadowing, all of the techniques that go into it, but I think it's a really interesting visual idea of what I'm talking about. So I want to relate this to still photography too, but real quick, I want to give a shout out to our sponsor today, who are the awesome folks over at Storyblocks. Storyblocks is the go-to resource for high-quality video footage, animations, music, sound effects, and images, all of them royalty-free. I've used Storyblocks on my own projects, and there are two things that I absolutely love about Storyblocks. So the first is that they've got a very extensive catalog. It's massive, and sometimes you think, I need a clip of something that's relatively obscure. You do a little search, and up it comes. So first of all, they've got a lot to choose from. Second of all, I like that sometimes you need sign-off from other people. You're not sure what's going to work in the final clip. Well, go ahead and download as many as you need. You're going to get the full high-resolution versions. Nothing's watermarked. It's an easy way to work, and it's just really the way to go. So with a Storyblocks subscription, you have access to over 1 million high-quality downloadable assets, and also check out their new tool called Maker. This is a no-experience necessary video editor that's included in the unlimited all-access plan, and it's a really useful tool for creating assets that are optimized for social media as an excellent resource for any content creator. Storyblocks have a variety of plans depending on your needs. All of them are affordable, and this is an awesome way to get access to some beautiful-looking footage, perfect for your own projects. So go ahead and check out Storyblocks using the link below this video. I think you're really going to like them. They really are an awesome resource. And I want to give a special shout out and thanks once again to the awesome folks over at Storyblocks for sponsoring this video. Okay, so we've talked about a high-end television production and how composition and the story is told through that, but what about still photography? I have an example that I want to share with you, and it's actually somebody that I've talked about a number of times on this channel. He's one of my very favorite photographers, and I'm talking, of course, about Henri Cartier-Bresson. Henri Cartier-Bresson was an extremely prolific and talented French photojournalist who pretty much left his mark not just on photography, but I think pretty much most photographers today are inspired by him on some level. And he developed a very unique style that worked really well. He was very consistent in how he was able to repeat this over and over. And I mean that not in the sense that he was repetitive in his photographs. In fact, I don't mean it that way at all. I mean he was just really highly consistent with a style. You could tell these photos belonged to Henri Cartier-Bresson. They were just really identifiable in that sense. A lot of this style was derived from the fact that he had a lot of experience, a formal art training, and then mixing this with what he says were skills that he learned from hunting and combining this into street photography, I think is really unique. And a lot of this is outlined in the intro to his famous book, The Decisive Moment. He talks a lot about his approach, and he's very candid and very honest about it. He thinks a lot in rule of thirds, rule of odds, even dynamic symmetry. There's a lot that goes into these compositions. I think he's a rare talent who was able to kind of visualize a lot of this stuff mentally in the back of his mind, and then therefore he was able to see it as he was shooting it. This is something that I want to explore as we move into the next couple weeks of videos too, because I think that's really important. We've talked a little bit about focal length and understanding how to see in terms of focal length what 50 millimeters looks like versus a 35 millimeter lens. I think that's really important, but also to be able to visualize these compositional elements and then know that one's going to work. It might work well for this shot. It might speak well for this shot. And then I think another is when you decide it's not going to work or you need to break it in that sense. And I think Henri Cartier-Bresson personified a lot of this just at a very high degree. But I also want to mention a second photographer who I have not really talked a whole lot about, who is another French photographer by the name of Marc Riboud. He actually passed away, I don't know, maybe 4 years ago or so. Marc was an incredible photographer as well. He was also a Magnum photographer. It was the same agency that Henri Cartier-Bresson has started. And he pretty much comes from the cloth of Henri Cartier-Bresson. In fact, some of his early work especially, it's hard to tell that it's not Henri Cartier-Bresson, but that was his starting point. And he was able to move through beyond that when he started working assignments. His subject matter was obviously much different. He was an incredible photographer. But when you look at these images, I think one of the most important things to note is composition. And this is what I said at the beginning of this video. Elements in a composition are there for a reason. That is your documentation. That is your presentation. That is what you are showing to the viewer. Everything is there for a reason, and it's placed for a reason. Anything that is not part of that composition is not in the photograph. I know that sounds obvious, but we all have photographs where there's something that's distracting or it's taking away from the intent of the composition. This is hard to do. It's one thing to do it in a studio environment where you have ultimate control of every variable, like you do in studio photography, or even like if you're doing portraits, something like that, or even a television show, let's say. But when you're improvising and you're shooting in a street style, this is very difficult to do. Sometimes Riboud, you see he does it with focal length. Sometimes you see that he's just very patient, waiting for the decisive moment, if you will, just the right time to click that shutter. And this requires an enormous amount of patience more than anything, but also talent and the ability to see and wait and just put that extra effort into your work. And I think photography tends to be one of those things where it doesn't take a whole lot of talent, especially nowadays where everything's automatic, to aim and press the button. Even the focus will go in for you. So that does not necessarily make a great photograph. What makes a great photograph is the intent of the photographer, the ability to visualize what you're going to see, to pre-visualize where things are going to move or where they're going to be, and to know where that decisive moment is, and to understand those compositional elements. That's the most important thing. And I know that everything we've talked about in this video has been a little bit stylized and nostalgic. Mad Men was made as a modern show looking back, and it was intended to be nostalgic. I think Riboud and even Henri Cartier-Bresson, both of those gentlemen, they were not trying to be nostalgic. They were of their time. They're nostalgic now because we're looking at that work 50, 60 years later. But my point is that you've got to understand what came before. If you don't understand what's come before you, it's going to be really hard to make any kind of impact with your own work. I think that's something we all strive for, but a lot of people are, I don't know if it's lazy or they just don't know where to start or what it is, but a lot of people don't understand the historical precedence that comes before them. And that's one of the most important things you can possibly observe. We're going to talk more about composition, obviously, in future videos. I really need to update my old videos. They are years and years old now, and things have changed, and I think they could be a little bit better. Information is still there. But anyway, I want to hear what you guys have to say. Drop me a comment below. Let me know what you think, or if you have any questions. I'll see you guys in the next video. Until then, later.